1 Samuel chapter 3, verse 10. And the Lord came and stood and called, as at other times, Samuel, Samuel. Then Samuel answered, Speak, for thy servant heareth. A New York columnist decided that he was going to do a little experiment. He was convinced that most people didn't listen to what he said, particularly when they went to parties. So he was invited to a party and he decided to do this experiment. He purposely arrived late, and when he arrived late, the hostess greeted him and he explained why he was late. He said, Well, I had to stop on the way to kill my mistress, and it took me a little longer than I expected. The hostess, without blinking an eye, said, Well, I was almost late myself. We're all quite busy these days. A little later in the same party, the columnists mingled around, and one person said, Well, what do you do for a living? And he said, Well, I'm the executor at the state penitentiary. And the person responded and said, Well, that must be interesting work. I hope you have good business this year. Most people don't listen. They don't listen. They got things going on in their own mind. They got their own distractions. They got their own things going on. And sometime during these next 15, 20, 30 minutes, you're going to go off somewhere. And then you're going to come back and say, What did he say? Because it takes discipline to listen. And people often don't have the discipline to do it. So listening is something we do every day. How well we listen is another question. How well we hear is another question. To show you the difference, here's what Jesus said. He said it many times. Let him that hath ears to hear. Well, who is that? Everybody, right? I guess there's some people who are earless around, but I've not seen very many in my life. So it's generally speaking to everybody. But he says, He that hath ears to hear, let him hear. So it's more than just having ears. It's engaging yourself enough that you listen to what people say. And sometimes we are, maybe many times, we're guilty of, as people are talking to us, begin to formulate our own ideas as to what we're going to say if they ever take a pause. And if they ever take a breath, we're going to interrupt and tell them what we think. Not based necessarily on what we've heard, but maybe what we think we've heard, or we've let bias or judgment come into the way. So I ask you this morning, how good are you at listening? How good are you at the discipline when it comes to listening what God says to you or listening to what someone else has to say? That's the point of the message today. So let's talk about Samuel. Let me give you a little background. Samuel, here in this chapter, is at the temple of Shiloh, and it's late at night, and he is laid down to sleep. We imagine, it's a guess, but we imagine that he was 8, 9, 10 years old when this event took place. And while he's laying there, Samuel hears this voice in the night. It doesn't really startle him. I think for most young kids that age, it would scare him to death, but it doesn't seem to startle him. In fact, what he thinks is, he thinks that Eli is calling him. And now you'll recall Samuel, let me give you just a little history and we'll catch back up with the story. Samuel is an unusual child because his mother, Hannah, in chapter 1 that tells you the story, Hannah was barren. I hesitate to even bring this up because it confuses people, but in that day there was another wife. So she had a competing wife. Elkanah had 2 wives. And the other wife was having kids, and Hannah's not having any. She's barren. So she takes her complaint to the Lord. And as she's there in the temple praying and asking God to help her, give her a son, specifically praying that God would give her a son, she was so burdened that she moved her lips, but no sound came out. And when Eli, the high priest, saw her moving her lips without speaking anything, he jumped to the conclusion that she was drunk. That's pretty wild, isn't it? And so he rebukes her and says, you shouldn't be drinking here and praying. Who wants to pray to God when they're drunk? Do you think he's going to listen to you? And she says, oh, no, sir, you misunderstand me. I'm not drunk. I'm a woman of a burdened and broken spirit because I am barren, and I'm just praying and asking God to give me a son. And Eli says, well, the Lord grant you your request. And she says, well, if God will, and he told God this, if God will give me a son, then I will give him back to God. Well, you know the story. I mean, here we are. Samuel is born. And Samuel, the name means heard of God. So she names him, God answered my prayer, Samuel. And so Samuel, when he's weaned, Hannah places Samuel under the care of Eli the high priest, and he's raised there under his tutelage so that he's given back to God, and Samuel hopefully will grow up to be a great man. Now, it's some years later after he's gone, weaned, probably about 2 years old. He's weaned, he goes and lives there. And now it's 5 or 6, 8 years later. We're not sure about the time. But he's laying in his bed late at night, and this voice comes to him, and he assumes it's Eli. So he gets up out of bed, he runs to Eli's room, and he says, yes, sir, you called me? I'm here. What can I do for you? What do you need? And Eli, he doesn't get mad, he doesn't get upset. And he's an old man, he's in his 90s at this point. He doesn't get upset, he doesn't get mad. He said, no, I didn't call you, go back to bed. So Samuel goes back to bed and he lays down there and he hears a voice again. And he gets up out of bed and he runs to Samuel's house, Eli's room, and he says, you called me? Yes, what do you need? And Eli again says, no, son, I didn't call you. Go back and lay down in bed. So he does. And he lays back down in bed, and the third time he hears a voice. And you know what he does? He gets up out of bed and runs to Eli's room and says, yes, sir, you called me? Now, you would probably get a little upset with this kid at this point and say, would you go lay down and I'll get up again? If you get up again, I'm going to whoop you. But Eli doesn't. Eli just says, I know what's going on. The Lord's speaking to this boy. And so he tells Eli, he says, the next time you hear that voice, you just say, speak, Lord, for thy servant heareth. Great advice. If God's going to speak to you, you know what you need to do? You need to listen. Oftentimes our prayer life, I put Vespie at the head of the line. Most of the time our prayer life is pouring out our needs to God and never taking time to listen to what he might say to us. So listen. Speak, Lord, for thy servant heareth. Well, the story goes, that's exactly what he does in verse 10. And then if you read the rest of the verses, God did speak to him and told him the judgment that he was going to bring upon Eli and his house, and that he was going to make Samuel a great man. And Samuel does become a great man. He becomes the last judge of Israel. He becomes the first great prophet of Israel. He anoints both Saul and David as king. That's because he listened to the voice of God and listened to God's calling. Now, I want to tell you just a couple of things this morning, and I will be done. First of all, this reminds us the importance of listening to God. And number two, I'll tell you, listening to one another. Most of us are not going to hear mysterious voices. I've dealt with that as a mental health counselor. I've had people come to me, we call it auditory hallucinations. And it's a very scary thing when someone has those voices in their head. I've talked to people who have had voices in their head that it's just a continual cursing and blaspheming God. Can you imagine living with such a thing? I've had people who have come and talked to me about auditory hallucinations who necessarily are not bad things. And it can be controlled through medication, and I've seen in dealing with folks like that some success. But most of you folks are not going to have that. It's a mental health illness. But you can hear God speak to you. This is much different now than then. In the Old Testament, it wasn't unusual for God to speak audibly to people. We find that throughout the Bible. He spoke to Abraham audibly. In Genesis chapter 22, it's often two words, two calls. Abraham, Abraham. And he answers. He talks audibly to Isaac. He talks audibly to Jacob. In fact, he wrestled Jacob. He talked audibly to Moses out of the burning bush. He talked audibly to Joshua, appearing as the captain of the Lord's hosts. And I could go on and on and on throughout the Old Testament. But now God doesn't so much speak audibly. Now, I'm not going to say he never does. Who knows the mind of the Lord? It would be foolish for me, for this finite man to stand here and say, well, God will never audibly speak to you. Because who knows what God's going to do? God's never audibly spoken to me. That doesn't mean he can't speak audibly to you. But primarily, the way God speaks to you today, would you like to guess? It's through the Bible. Because, see, they didn't have the full Bible in those days. I'll tell you this, God has spoken to me numerous times, more times than I can count, through the Bible. I read the Bible, God speaks to me. I read the Bible, God directs me. I read the Bible, God convicts me. He knocks me around sometimes. I read the Bible, and God encourages me. God speaks to me all the time through the Bible. But there's another way God can speak to you. The story is in 1 Kings, where Elijah, the prophet, goes up on this mountain, and the Lord sends him there, and there's this great wind that comes through and knocks down the trees and breaks the rocks. But the Bible says the Lord was not in the wind. And then there was an earthquake, and God was not in the earthquake. And then there was a fire, and God was not in the fire. And you remember how the story ends. Then there was a still small voice. And that's how God spoke. God will speak through your conscience. Just like Samuel, when you lay down at night, the Lord will come along and just go, hey, are you awake? I'm not letting you sleep yet. We need to talk about some things. And then the Lord works that way through you. I don't know how to explain it unless you've ever experienced it. But God is interested when you pray. Remember that prayer doesn't end when you finish talking. We want to enumerate and enunciate and emphasize all that we have needs of, and we want to tell God all that's going on, and there's nothing wrong with that. I don't mean that at all. You should. God knows your needs, but he still wants you to bring those needs to him. My point is for you to just not stop listening when you've stopped talking. Do you want God to listen to you? I mean, do you really? Do you really want God to listen to you? Do you think he wants you to listen to him? You know, it's a two-way street. That's what communication is. The last I checked, communication is a two-way street. Now that brings me to my second point. And it's important that we take time to listen to one another. Mark Morrell writes about family relationships. And in one particular article, he's writing about multitasking. And he said he was sitting in the living area of their house, and he asked his daughter a question about a friend of hers. And you know what she's doing, as most teenagers are. She's on her phone. And she gives him a one-word answer. And he said to her, I don't think you're listening to me. And she says, oh, I'm listening to you. I'm just multitasking. And he explained to her, that he felt when she did that he felt unimportant to her. That what he was saying really wasn't making any difference in her life. He says we talked about it, and she understood his concerns. And then as he went away, he thought, I wonder how many times I've done that to her. Uh-huh. You know what my pet peeves is? I think I'm going to do it one day. But one of my pet peeves is when I go in a restaurant, particularly now with my life situation, when I go in a restaurant and I see a couple in that restaurant and they're both on their phones, that gets my blood pressure up. What are you doing? So there's mom and there's dad and there's the teenager and there's the kid and they're all going. If I get arrested, it's because I have gone over at that restaurant and shook that man and gone, what is wrong with you? Leave your phone in the car. Now, I know if you got kids and you got to have contact or you got a job and you're on call, I understand. I'm not being fanatical about it, but can't you just put it on silent? Or can you put it on do not disturb? Or can't you fix it where the people who just really, you can do that. You can fix it where just the important people in your life can contact you if they need to. But most of the time that don't happen. You know what you're doing? You're checking the scores. You're checking the Hollywood Reporter. You're checking Fox, or you're checking CNN, or you're finding out what's the latest news. Oh, you mean Nick Saban resigned? The world is coming to an end. Did you hear that? I'm not saying don't keep up with current events. I'm just saying don't multitask when someone's having a conversation with you. I have a fault. Confess your faults one to another. And it is a fault of mine. I admit. Maybe you have the same fault. Maybe you don't. But when I'm in a one-on-one conversation with somebody, it's very difficult for me. I don't know why. I've tried to self-analyze myself. But I have a very difficult time looking at someone in the eye when I'm having a one-on-one conversation. It's been pointed out to me by people I love. Because I'll just look over here or look over there and not lock on them, And it gives the impression that I'm not interested. And I don't want to give that impression. I'm trying to work on it. I'm trying to figure out why I do it. I really don't know. But don't do that. Don't do that. If I'm talking to you and I'm looking off somewhere, say, hey, preacher, don't do that. Look at me. One of the things as a public speaker, and I've been doing this 40 years now, one of the things as a public speaker, if you are speaking and everybody's doing this, and you don't get their eyes, and they're not looking up, they don't have their head up. Now that may be their way of listening, and they may be able to listen better that way. It's not for me to judge. That might be, if that's the best way for you to listen, do it. But it's challenging to the speaker, not if one person's doing it, that would be ridiculous. But if everybody's going, you're beginning to go, huh? Is anybody out there listening? Is anybody listening? Two men were talking over coffee one day, and one said, I'm concerned about my wife. She talks to herself quite a bit. And the other one said, well, mine does too. She just doesn't know it. She thinks I'm listening. No one would be surprised if the biggest complaint of the women in this room were to be, he never listens to me. But there's some ugly man in here that's going to come back and say, well, she never shuts up. Not any of the men in this room, but somebody would say that. It's important that when someone is speaking to us, that we give them our undivided attention. Give them our focus. It's one way, I think it's an important way, that you tell someone that you love them by giving them your attention. I played high school tennis. You would never believe that, would you? But I did. I played high school tennis. I wasn't bad. I wasn't really good, but I wasn't bad. And I remember my coach in high school telling me this, and it's become a life lesson for me. It's really helped me. I'll give it to you. He had this great little phrase. He said, nothing but the ball. You know what he meant by that? In tennis. It's important in baseball too. You've told your kids, you've told those playing softball players, keep your eye on the ball. Keep your eye on the ball. But in tennis, it's very important because unlike baseball or softball, in tennis, you keep your eye on the ball all the way to the racket. See that form? Can't you just tell I played? Do I remind you of Nadal when I do that? So you take that back and you keep your eye on the ball all through the racket, but you know what you do when the ball leaves your racket? You keep your eye on the ball. Because that guy's going to be, or that lady is going to be wherever that ball is. So if I keep my eye on the ball off my racket back to the other court, wherever that hits, then I keep my eye on the ball as it comes back to me, I'm going to have a lot better chance hitting it back. All that is focus. And what does that mean for us? That means you always keep your eye on the ball. The ball in this situation is whoever is talking to you. Give them your attention. Bruce Larson is a great a great author, and he said this: one of the greatest gifts that God has ever given to us in life is the gift of listening. Listening is the key to success, perhaps the most important key to success in the survival of relationships. He writes, I'm convinced that every year some marriages will fail because two people, though they are lovers, do not know how to listen to one another. Even one who looks strong and adequate may be trying to communicate, help me, I'm frightened, I'm lonely. Every year there are parents and children who begin an irreparable breach because they don't feel like when they put their feelings into words that anyone is listening. Are you listening? Is anybody out there listening? You need to take that listening skill home with you. And you need to listen to your wife. And you need to listen to your husband. And you need to listen to your parents. And you need to listen to your kids. Oh, there's a unique thing. Listen to my kids? Yeah. They're trying to tell you something. And I challenge you this. Are you brave enough? Are you men brave enough to go home with your wife and ask her this question? Or if you're in a relationship, are you willing to ask your loved one this question? Do you feel like God listened to you? Be ready. What if they say no? You know what? I don't feel like you listen to me. Then you need to correct that, not be offended, not be a whiny little baby and go suck your thumb and sit in the corner. Right? Why don't you feel like I listen to you? How can I improve my ways of listening to you? What am I doing that makes you think I'm not? Well, you're watching TV when I'm trying to talk to you. Yeah, I probably am too much. You're on that phone. You're playing your game. What are you doing? There's this thing called, I've researched a little bit, it's called deep listening. I've never heard about it. But I discovered in preparing for this message. And it has several points to it. You might want to look it up, but I'm going to give you the first one, the most important. Deep listening means before you start a conversation, be present. Eliminate all distractions and get ready to listen without interruption. You know, you can call whoever's calling you, call them back, right? You don't have to answer the text in world record time. It can wait. And then he goes on to say, become aware of any judgments, put them aside. Keep your challenges and your solutions to yourself for now. And get ready to be empathetic, curious, and humble. You'll have the chance to explain how you feel when it's your turn to talk. I think that's really good. I'm going to try to do that from now on. I'm going to try to listen better and listen more. Because I'm convinced, after thinking about this for a few days, the most important sign that you show your love to someone else is to give them your ears. Oh, I love you with all my heart. How about loving somebody with all your ears? Listen. Listen. And see, it not only translates in relationship with people, it also translates in our relationship with God. Because here's Samuel. Samuel? Samuel! What's he say? Speak, Lord, for thy servant heareth. Lord, I'm listening. You walk away out of here today and you go away and you say to yourself, when you have some alone time and you have some quiet time, you look up to heaven and you say, God, I'm listening. Whatever you want to say to me, whatever you've got to say, I'm not giving you a chance in a while to talk. You'll become a greater man if you do. You'll become a greater woman if you do. You'll become a greater young person if you do. Because see what happened to Samuel when he's only 8 or 9? Are you going to let an 8 or a 9 or a 10-year-old outdo you? Look what he became. Why did he become such a great man, preacher? I think it's because he started right here and he listened. And just as the Lord called Samuel, God will call you. I don't know what he's not going to have you be a prophet. He's not going to have you a priest. Those days are gone. But he may call you to do something that he has prepared for you to do. And it doesn't matter how old you are or how young you are. God will call you